Welcome back to the Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. We are on chapter 8, A Cap on a Peg. You've seen my father? Frank asked the truck driver. Well, I did see him on Monday, Sam said slowly, but I don't know where he is now. Come in and sit down, Frank urged. Tell us everything you know. The four walked to the living room and Mr. Bates sat down uneasily in a large chair. Where did you see Mr. Hardy? Mrs. Hardy asked eagerly. But Sam Bates was not to be hurried. I'm a truck driver, see, he said. Mostly I drive in Bayport, but sometimes I have a run to another town. That's how I come to be out there that morning. Out where? Along the short road. I'm sure it was Monday, because when I came home for supper, my wife had been doing the washing, and she only does that on Monday. That was the day Dad left, Joe exclaimed. Well, please go on with the story, Frank prodded Sam Bates. Where did you see him? The truck driver explained that his employer had sent him to a town down the coast to deliver some furniture. I was about a half a mile from the old Pollock place when I saw a man walking along the road. I waved to him like I always do to people in the country, and then I see it's Mr. Hardy. You know my father? Frank asked. Only from his pictures, but I'm sure it was him. Dad left here in a sedan, Joe spoke up. Did you see one around? No, I didn't. What was the man wearing? Mrs. Hardy asked. Well, let's see. Dark brown trousers and a brown and black plaid sports jacket. He wasn't wearing a hat, but I think he had a brown cap in one hand. Mrs. Hardy's face went white. Yes, that was my husband. After a moment, she added, Can you tell us anything more? I'm afraid not, ma'am, the trucker said. You see, I was kind of in a hurry that morning, so I didn't notice nothing else. He arose to leave. We certainly thank you for coming to tell us, Mr. Bates, Mrs. Hardy said. Yes, you've given us a valuable lead, Frank added. Now we'll know where to look for Dad. I sure hope he shows up, the driver said, walking towards the door. Let me know if I can help any. When the man left, Joe turned to Frank, puzzled. Do you suppose Dad hid his car and was walking to the Pollitt house? If so, why? Maybe he picked up a clue at the deserted farmhouse on Hillcrest Road, Frank suggested, and it led to the old Pollitt place. If he left his car somewhere, he must have been planning to investigate the haunted house without being seen. Something must have happened to him, Joe cried out. Frank, I'll bet he went to Pollitt's and that fake ghost got him. Let's go look for Dad right away. But Mrs. Hardy broke in. Her expression was firm. I don't want you boys to go to that house alone. Maybe you'd better notify the police and let them make a search. The brothers looked at each other. Finally, Frank, realizing how alarmed she was, said, Mother, is it possible Dad is there spying on some activities offshore, and he's all right but can't leave to phone you? The pilot line must have been disconnected. If Joe and I go out there and find him, we can bring back a report. Mrs. Hardy gave a wan smile. You're very convincing, Frank. When you put it that way, all right. I'll give my permission, but you mustn't go alone. Why not, Mother? We can look out for ourselves, Joe insisted. Get some of the boys to go with you. There's safety in numbers, his mother said. The boys agreed to this plan and got busy on the telephone rounding up their pals. Chet Morton and Biff Hooper agreed to go, and they suggested asking Tony Preto and Phil Cohen, two more of the Hardys' friends at Bayport High. Phil owned the motorcycle. He and Tony said they could go along. Shortly after lunch, the group set out. Chet rode with Frank, Biff with Joe, and Tony with Phil. The three motorcycles went out of Bayport, past the Tower Mansion, and along the shore road. They passed the Kane farmhouse, Hillcrest Road, and at last came in sight of the steep cliff rising from Varmint Bay, and crowned by the rambling frame house where Felix Pollitt have lived. All this time they had watched carefully for a sign of Mr. Hardy's car, but found none. "Your dad hit it well," Chet remarked. "It's possible someone stole it," Frank told him. As the boys came closer to the pilot property, Phil said to Tony, "Lonely looking place, isn't it?" "Sure is. Good haunt for a ghost." When they were still some distance from the lane, Frank, in the lead, brought his motorcycle to a stop and signaled the other two drivers to do likewise. "What's the matter?" Chet asked. "We'd better sneak up on the place quietly. If we go any further, the ghost is there, he'll hear the motorcycles. I vote we leave them here under the trees and go the rest of the way on foot." The boys hid their machines in a clump of bushes beside the road, and then the 6 searchers went on towards the lane. "We'll separate here," Frank decided. "3 of us take one side of the lane, and the rest the other. Keep to the bushes as much as possible, and when we get near the house, lay low for a while and watch the place. When I whistle, you can come out of the bushes and go up to the house." "That's a good idea," Joe agreed. "Biff, Tony, and I will take the left side of the road." "Okay." The boys entered the weeds and undergrowth on either side of the lane. In a few minutes they were lost to view, and only an occasional snapping and crackling of branches indicated their presence. The 6 sleuths crept forward, keeping well from the lane. After about 10 minutes, Frank raised his hand as a warning to Chet and Phil. He had caught a glimpse of the house through the dense thicket. They went on cautiously until they reached the edge of the bushes. From behind the screen of leaves they looked towards the old building. An expression of surprise crossed Frank's face. "Someone's living here," he exclaimed in astonishment. From where the boys stood, they hardly recognized the old place. Weeds that had filled the flower beds on their last visit had been completely cleared away. Leaves and twigs had been raked up and the grass cut. A similar change had been wrought in the house. The hanging shutters had been put in place and the broken library window glass replaced. "What do you suppose has happened?" Chet whispered. Frank was puzzled. "Let's wait a minute before we go any further." The boys remained at the edge of the bushes watching the place. A short time later a woman came out of the house carrying a basket of clothes. She walked over to the clothesline stretched between 2 trees and began hanging up the laundry. Shortly afterward a man came out and strode across the yard to the shed, where he started filling a basket with logs. The boys looked at one another in bewilderment. They had expected to find the same sinister and deserted place they had visited previously. Instead, there was a scene of domestic tranquility. "There's not much use in our hiding any longer," Frank whispered. "Let's go out and question these people." He gave the prearranged whistle. The other 3 boys appeared, and the entire group walked boldly up the lane across the yard. The man in the woodshed saw them first and straightened up, staring at them with an expression of annoyance. The woman at the clothesline heard their footsteps and turned to face them, her hands on her hips. Her gaunt face wore an unpleasant scowl. "What do you want?" demanded the man emerging from the shed. He was short and thin with close-cropped hair, and he needed a shave. His complexion was swarthy, his eyes narrow under coarse, black brows. At the same time, another man came out of the kitchen and stood on the steps. He was stout and red-haired, with scraggly mustache. "Yeah, who are you?" he asked. "We didn't know anyone was living here," Frank explained, edging over to the kitchen door. He wanted to get a look inside the house if possible. "Well, we're living here now," said the red-haired man, "and we don't like snoopers." "We're not snooping," Frank declared. "We are looking for a man who disappeared from Bayport." Grunted the woman. "Why do you think he's around here?" the thin man put in. "He was last seen in this neighborhood." "What does he look like?" "Tall and dark. He was wearing a brown suit and a sports jacket and a cap." "There hasn't been anybody around here since we rented this place and moved in," the red-haired man said gruffly. "There seems to be no prospect of gaining information from the unpleasant trio, so the boys started to leave. But Frank had reached the kitchen door. As he glanced in, he gave a start. Hanging on a peg was a brown sports cap. It looked exactly like the one his father owned, and which he had worn the morning he had disappeared. And that's the end of chapter 8. Thank you for joining me, and be sure to join me for chapter 9.